the Bible. I said, I want you to understand my world, at least my world before I got blacklisted in Silicon Valley. My world was sitting at lunch with all these atheists and Hindus and Muslims. And if I said the Bible says, they'll go, well, the Bhagavad Gita says, or the Quran says, and then we get an argument about which is the right book. But if I said philosophy allows us to derive that something exists that created the entire universe. And science of the Big Bang shows that this really happened, and then we can derive the originator, and start going back that way. So what you want to do when you come talk about the historical evidence of the resurrection of Jesus, you want to try and avoid the Bible as much as possible. Unfortunately, to prove it, we have to use the Bible. And so what I do before this step is I start by proving God exists without using the Bible. In fact, I have a book out there called Who is Agent X? Do I talk about it? I don't know if I talk about it in here. I'll show you the book when I get to it. Yeah. Let me see. Yeah, I'll show you the book. And I go through a sequence of steps that I'm going to mention in a few minutes. But first of all, I want to tell you a story. When I was an engineer, one of the companies I did the very first MPEG-4 video chip, very first chip ever made. We did the MP3 chip first, and then this company recruited me. And I went there and we did the first MPEG video encoder. This was 1992 or so. And there was a company in Israel that called me, that was one of our clients, and they flew in because they wanted to do this huge video encoding system back down in Israel. Now remember, in those days, the video encoders were about this big. One was that big. Today you have 14 of them in your iPhone, so, and 18 in your Android. Never mind, I'm just kidding. But anyway, so he comes there and he's like, yeah, we're trying to do this. And his name was Asher. I said, Asher, you're based in Israel. He goes, yeah, in Tel Aviv, just outside of Jerusalem, or, in Israel, just near the airport. And I said, oh, well, Asher, you've got to come up with a reason why I have to fly down to Israel to help you. He goes, oh, no problem. And so like 2 weeks later, my boss calls me and goes, Neil, I think we're going to have to fly you to Jerusalem. I'm like, oh, yeah, man, that's a pain. Yeah, okay, I'll go. So I fly there, all expense paid trip, and I land there, and it turns out, I land in Tel Aviv, and Tel Aviv, I hope you're not from Tel Aviv. I thought it was the ugliest city in the world. I'm like, this place, who designed this place? I mean, it's ugly. It's just like modern, and it's just hideous. And I thought, man, and so I would work with Asher all day long, and at night I would go back and I'd look on the the little maps that they had then. And I would look at it, goes, oh man, here I am in Tel Aviv and I want to go to Jerusalem, but it's halfway across the country. How am I going to get there, man? So I was thinking about, man, how can I go there? Because we're working all day, and sometimes we'd start at 9 a.m. and we'd get done by 9 p.m. We were trying to get this thing working. I only had 2 weeks there, so I got to figure out something. So that one night I get back, while I'm at work, I said, Asher, look, I really, really want to get to Jerusalem sometime, but we're so busy, I don't know if we have time. He goes, oh, why don't we go there for dinner tonight? I'm like, dinner? It's halfway across the country. He goes, yeah, it might take about 45 minutes, maybe an hour with traffic. I'm like, what? He goes, it's 30 miles away. You see, it's 30 miles, it's 60 miles across the whole country. This is a tiny country. We're not talking about a massive country. And so we go that evening. He says, okay, we'll stop work at 6, and, traffic will be dying down. So we get to Jerusalem about 7:30, and it's a beautiful city, and the weather is perfect. I mean, it's an amazing place. And I get there, and and I realize that Jerusalem, like the country, is tiny. I mean, it is very small. In fact, you can walk across from one side of the old city in about 8 minutes. It's 3/4 of a mile. In fact, during Jesus' time, the city wall was even smaller than that. In fact, you can see where the city was actually, where the wall was then, and then it was made larger later on. So. And if you look at that little star there, at some point, that turned out that Saturday or that day, the next, I don't know if it was a Saturday or what day it was, but it was Yom Kippur. Yom is day, Kippur is Day of Atonement, so it's atonement, so yeah, Day of Atonement. And I said, and Asher said, hey, we can get you a driver to drive you around for Yom Kippur and the Shabbat, and you can drive around. And he said, but he'll have to be a Muslim driver because the Jews are all observing Yom Kippur. I said, that's fine. I grew up in Sudan and Yemen. So I've been around, I grew up most of my young age amongst Arabic-speaking people. He said, yeah, well, then you can even speak to him in Arabic. I said, yeah, but my Arabic is useless because I came to America and started watching Star Trek in English. So, but anyway, so we had a lot in common. And so, yeah, he takes me to all these places. And one of the places he takes me is that little red star, red and yellow star down there. And he walks me in, and there's like a big blue mound covered in blue with the Star of David all over it. And you can't walk in unless you cover your head. And of course, I don't wear a hat. So they give me a little piece of cardboard, and my head is bigger than most people. So I look like Laurel and Hardy. I'm walking in there, I'm trying to balance it. And there are a bunch of these Jewish people praying there. Now, they're not praying to the mound, but they're praying at the mound. And I turned to the guide and I asked him, what is this place? Because he didn't tell me. And he said, oh, this is the tomb of King David. And so I look, and it's like this really, interesting place. And I'm like, wow, there are a lot of tourists here, a lot of not American tourists, but Jewish people. So as I mentioned, I was born at a very early age in Ghana. I didn't mention that yet, but I mentioned I grew up in Africa and places like that. My dad was a scientist and a professor in physics. I grew up in a Christian family. My parents are Christian. My ancestors are Christian. But then once I was born in Ghana, we moved to Jamaica, Ethiopia, Sudan, Yemen. And when I was in India, where my parents are from originally, I was surrounded by Muslims, Hindus, Jains, Sikhs, Zoroastrians, and Buddhists, right? Or that's how you say it in America. In India, it's Buddhist. So I would ask myself and my parents, why are we Christians? Why am I a Christian and not a Muslim like most of my friends? Why are we not Hindus like most of the people in India? And my dad was an atheist and a communist and a Marxist until I was about 6. So I'm like, why are we not atheists, right? So in fact, a lot of my cousins, even though we come from a Christian family, a lot of their cousins are Marxists. And I sort of asked myself, am I a Christian because my parents are Christians? Am I a Christian just because it's culturally Christian it's in my culture to be a Christian? Or am I a Christian because it's true? And then one day a dear friend died, and I asked myself, is this the end to life? Is death the end game? You see, I don't want to believe in a convenient fantasy. I'm a scientist. I want evidence to know if what I believe is true. Is death really the end game? So I studied, as Jeff mentioned, I started studying apologetics. And most of you know this, but it's good to review. Jeff mentioned it comes from 1 Peter 3:15. Always be prepared to give an apologia to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect. That word apologia does not mean to say I'm sorry. It means a defense or explanation. I had a Sikh friend, and I invited him to an apologetics conference. You might have heard me say this before. And when I invited him, I said, hey, why don't you come to the apologetics conference? He says, I don't think I'll be interested. I said, well, you do know what apologetics is. He goes, oh, yeah, I do. I said, you do? That's quite impressive. He goes, yeah, it means that's where you apologize to me because I'm going to hell. I'm like, no. So anyway, he didn't come to that, but I gave him my book, Agent X. He read through it. He helped me edit it. And then he became a Christian a few years later. So it doesn't hurt to invite people to apologetics conferences, even if they think they don't know what it is. Anyway, so what is apologetics? Apologetics is the evidence and defense of the rational faith of Christianity using facts, logic, history, science, philosophy, and reasoning. And my ministry is called No Blind Faith, right? Because we never want blind faith. We always want a reason for the hope that we have within us. So Christianity, I say, isn't a blind faith. It's a rational faith built on a solid historical and logical foundation. Okay, this slide's going to be a bit messy to look at. So let me. That's a book, by the way. Wow, I'm going to edit this live here. So there are 6 steps that I go through. 1, I prove that faith should never be blind. So the fonts are going to be messed up in this because the transitions don't come over. But 2, I'm going to prove that God, I start with proving faith to never be blind, which is the no blind faith talk. I prove that God exists without using the Bible. Did I do that here, Jeff? Agent X, maybe not. But anyway. And then I prove that the New Testament is accurate using archaeology and manuscript evidence. I prove that Jesus really existed and rose from the dead, which is what this talk is. And then I explain why Christ had to die and why God must punish sin, which is the talk I did last time I was here. And then I talk about how evil and God can coexist. And that's actually the 5 and 6. No, actually, I did 6 last time and 5, I think, before that. Right? Okay. So what we have here is a whole systematic approach to this. Now, by the time I get to this talk, I've already done the first 3 of those. Right? So people have, and this is not going to be hard to read, I'll have to read it. People realize with apologetics that blind faith is dangerous and all-powerful God exists. The supernatural really exists. And in the Agent X talk, I talk about how science proves that there is a supernatural. And people go, what? No, science doesn't prove that. No, it does. Actually, see, the Big Bang, at the point of the Big Bang, we can calculate that there were at least 10 different dimensions. And you go, dimensions? What are those? Yeah, well, 10 to the minus 23 seconds after the Big Bang, those dimensions, the calculation shows that those dimensions kind of disappeared from our physical ability to view them or to interact with them. Well, what does that mean? Well, we know the 4 dimensions, height, length, width, and the 4th dimension is time. It's only half a dimension. You can only move forward in it. But there are 6 other dimensions. That means there are 6 other spatial dimensions. And in the Who's Agent X talk, I actually show you what those dimensions might be. But for now, we know that they are not material dimensions. They are not natural dimensions. So what are they? They are supernatural dimensions. Super means more than the natural. So they're supernatural. So science proves that there is supernatural dimensions. We just can't find out we can't interact with them, except we did spend $3 billion building the Large Hadron Collider. Why? To send a particle into one of those dimensions. And we found certain proof that those particles actually do leave I shouldn't say that, but we found the God particle, we found all these different particles. So there's very good reason to know that those dimensions actually are out there, and science kind of verifies it. So, now, with that, we know that there is only one God. Why? Because there's an all-powerful being, can only have one all-powerful being. So given all that, we have one all-powerful being, we have supernatural dimensions, we know that, and with the Agent X talk, I proved that God created the universe, and now we are at the point where we have to decide what to do with that information. So, I also wrote a book, it's called Daily Apologetics for Kids. I think we have a few copies outside. It's for kids between the age of 6 to 13 that go through a lot of these apologetics concepts. This is a month's worth, and we have the other months coming later. I just haven't gone around to it because I've been kind of busy. Okay, so Christianity is unlike all other religions because Christianity is based not only on the teachings of Jesus, but on the blood of Jesus. If there was no blood, there is no redemption of sin. If there's no redemption of sin, there is no salvation. If there's no salvation, there's no Christianity. And in that case, all we have is a social gathering. So you have to understand that Christianity is completely different from every other religion. Every other religion will still survive if you take away the major proponent of their religion. Like, let's say if you never had Muhammad, but you had the Quran, you would still have Islam, right? If you never had Krishna, well, many Hindus don't care if Krishna ever existed, but you still have the Bhagavad Gita, and so you have reincarnation, and you have the entire Hindu philosophy, parts of the Hindu philosophy. So it doesn't matter if the guy really exists or not, you still have the philosophy. Buddhism, it doesn't matter if Buddha really exists as long as you have his sevenfold path and so on and so forth, right? So is it 7 or is it 8? I can never remember. But anyway, but if you take away, in Christianity, if you take away Christ, we have no religion. If you take away Christ, you have no faith. If you take away Christ, you have no hope. If you take away Christ, you have no salvation. If you take away Christ, you have nothing, because Jesus didn't come to show us the way. He what? He came to be the way. He said, I am the way, the truth, and life. He came to be the way. And so without Jesus, you don't have anything. He also, in Corinthians, says, if there is no resurrection of the dead, and if Christ did not rise from the dead, then our faith is in vain, and we of all people are to be pitied. So I assume most of you guys are Christians here, but some of you may not be. But let me ask you, if you're not a Christian here today, if I could prove to you with a high degree of confidence that Jesus Christ died and rose from the dead physically, I'm not talking metaphorically or spiritually, I'm talking physically, like a scientist would look at him, and that he died and rose again, proving that he was God. Now, does he claim I'm going to be God? I am God. I'm going to die. I'm going to rise again. And I am going to show you that you need to repent for your sins by proving all this. Everything I talked about is true. Would you be willing to accept the consequences of that logic, regardless of what it means in your life? I have an atheist friend another atheist friend who helped edit my book. And at the end of the book, he said, this is a great book. I said, what do you think of the argument? I said, you helped me edit it. That proves that God exists. He says, well, yeah, I don't know. And I'm like, wait, you helped me edit the book. And you told me all the weaknesses in the argument. You gave me all your strongest arguments to put in the book and refute. See, the problem was he knew that there was a consequence to accepting Christ. He'd have to stop sleeping with his girlfriend. He'd have to do this. He'd have to do that. He'd have to do all these other things. So don't let the logic of your consequence force you to abandon the logic. Don't let the consequences of your logic force you to abandon the logic. Okay, so today we're going to talk about why is Jesus different from other good teachers, which we actually did. We told you that he's different from all the teachers. He's not a teacher. He didn't come to teach. He came to be. Okay, and then 2, we're going to talk about, did Jesus really exist? Did he really rise from the dead? Okay, so, why is Jesus different from all the other good teachers? Well, Jesus claimed to be God and claimed to prove it by rising from the dead. Jesus Christ, unlike all the other teachers and starters of religion, didn't come to show the way, but to be the way. So this is just a summary. Without Muhammad, you still have Islam. Without Krishna, you still have Hinduism. Without Jesus, you don't have Christianity. Okay, so now let's look at, normally if this was on a PC, each of those little bullet things would expand and show you. So you're like, I've been looking at the same slide twice. Yeah, well, I can't help that. Okay, so let's look at 2. Did Jesus Christ really exist? Well, now people are like, well, some people are like, oh, he's a legend. We don't have no idea if he really existed. Well, do you know we have more documentation by more people about Jesus than we do about Julius Caesar? We believe Julius Caesar existed. In fact, there are many figures in history that we have no problems accepting, but then they say, well, we have evidence. We don't have evidence for Jesus. Well, it turns out we do. Here's a guy named Cornelius Tacitus. It's going to be hard to read that, but he wrote around. He lived between 5580 to 11780. He says Christus, from whom the name got its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of Procurator Pontius Pilate. Right, so here's a Roman historian, probably didn't really care for the Christians. He didn't hate them necessarily, but he wasn't really pro-Christian. He tells us that Jesus was crucified during the reign of Tiberius. Now, Flavius Josephus was a Jewish historian. So if anything, an anti-Christian at the time, he fought in the Battle of Jotapa. I should mention this. I'm actually writing a book of my first novel, and it's called The Christ Commission. And in the Christ Commission, Emperor Trajan asked a Roman soldier, a centurion, who was at the Battle of Jerusalem that destroyed Jerusalem, to go back to Jerusalem and find the body of Jesus to prove that Christianity is false. And now it turns out that at this time, Tacitus is alive, and that's how you pronounce his name. Josephus is alive. Pliny is alive. I'm going to mention him certainly. And also Serrano, a great physician, is alive. And so it's a prime time for anything like this to happen. And so I thought, hey, this would be fun. It'd be like one of those, historical fiction novels thing. So I started doing it. I'm halfway through it. We'll see what happens, Anyway, so Josephus says this. He says, Ananias, the high priest, convened a meeting of the Sanhedrin and brought before him a man named James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, right? And certain others. He accused them of having transgressed the law and delivered them up to be stoned. And so James, the brother of Jesus, is killed by the Sanhedrin shortly after the resurrection of Jesus, so-called resurrection of Jesus. Okay, then we have Suetonius. Pliny, that's the guy I mentioned, right? Pliny goes out and he does a survey of Christians and he talks to them about it and he reports back to Trajan. Actually, it reports back to his uncle, but Trajan's in the leadership at the time. Then Thallus, and of course the Jewish Talmuds talk about Jesus. They say he was a son who has unknown father. In fact, they claim his father was a Roman soldier. And so they talk about Jesus. So over and over again, we see that Jesus Christ was a real human being. He actually existed. He walked on the earth. Now, I remember growing up, and as I was growing up, I heard about stories of Jesus. I read in the Bible. I'd never seen him anywhere else. And when I found out about these things, I was reading a book by a friend of mine, now a friend, named Josh McDowell. And this is that's why I wanted to meet him. And it's called The Evidence Demands a Verdict. And I went to the library. He said, these are the books you can find. And I looked up all these documents in the library at the time, no internet. And I remember when I read the passage by Tacitus, I'm like, wow, this guy was real. Because it was the very first time in my entire life I had seen somebody other than a Christian write it. But most Christians don't know that all this evidence is out there. Okay. So, now without touching the Bible once so far, we know that Jesus existed and he was crucified by Pilate during the reign of Tiberius Caesar, and there were a group of people running around claiming that he came back to life. And that's exactly what the Bible has been saying for the last 2,000 years. Okay. So let's now talk about, did he really rise from the dead? I mean, you can exist. Muhammad existed. Buddha probably existed. Krishna, nobody knows, but that doesn't mean they're God, right? I mean, anyone can claim to be God, but are they God? I mean, Charles Manson claimed to be Jesus Christ, but was he Jesus Christ? No, right? So anyone can claim to be God. The question is, did he rise from the dead? That's a proof of him. I want to pause here. Maybe you've lost someone close. Maybe you fear death. Where do you find your hope? One atheist argument against God is the fact that when babies die, when children die, that when innocent people are killed by tornadoes, a good God can't exist. Now, we talked about that a few months ago here. But an atheist once asked in a debate with William Lane Craig, said, what do you say to a child who is dying? You poor child, God has ordained that you will die of this disease. He could save you, but he doesn't care. Tough. Is death our final destiny? Is death the victor in the end? The end of life, the end of hope, the end of everything, the end of you? Is death so complete? And is the grave an impossible portion to beat? Is death the end game? Paul says, if there is no resurrection of the dead and Christ did not rise up from the dead, then our faith is in vain, and we of all people are to be pitied. This is very, very, very important. Did we come up with the concept of the resurrection because we didn't like death? That some people say, hey, the best way to get people is to give them some afterlife fables. And so they're like, oh, yeah, that's why I want to believe this religion, right? Did we just come up with that so that, I mean, do we believe that because, hey, I don't want the fact that my mom died. I don't want the fact that she disappeared into nothing. Or is it true? Is it a convenient fantasy or is it real? Why should I believe that I should not be scared of death? Why should I believe in the resurrection of the dead and eternal life? Only if Jesus proved that he could beat death. Did Jesus prove he was God? Well, something happened 2,000 years ago that changed the entire course of history. Some inexplicable occurrence took place, and mankind has never been the same since. It's a single mystery that has changed history. Something so unusual happened that it motivated a handful of scared fishermen to leave everything that was familiar to them to go out to the most dangerous corners of the world. One of them came to India and converted my ancestors in 51 AD. That's how there are Indians and Christians in India. And they went to the most dangerous parts of the world. They all got killed. And that mystery changed the history. And that is the mystery of the empty grave. Right? So there's an empty grave, and after 2,000 years, mankind has not been able to explain how the grave came to be empty and how that empty grave changed so many lives. So we're going to be detectives. We're going to put on a detective hat, and we're going to figure out how the grave came to be empty. And the first place I want to start is start with a friend of mine called J. Warner Wallace. He's a cold case detective. This guy's been on 48 Hours, 60 Minutes, all that, with all these cases. He's discovered cases that were like 40 years old. He's gone and found the murderer who was still living, right? One of them was here in Palo Alto or some Sunnyvale or something, right? He caught this engineer guy. You know, these engineers, you can't trust them anyway. And he figured out how the engineer killed his girlfriend or whatever. So Jay Warner says there are two kinds of evidence that we use in these cold cases. And we have a cold case here. It's 2,000 years old cold case. And he actually does this. He has a cold case detective looks at the resurrection. I've used some of the information. Most of this is from Josh McDowell's information and other research I've done. So there are two types of evidence: direct evidence, which supports the truth of an assertion directly. That's without any need for additional evidence, right? Circumstantial evidence is evidence that relies on an inference to connect it to the conclusion of fact, like forensic evidence, like a fingerprint of the scene of the crime. So we don't have any direct evidence. There's nobody alive today that said, yeah, I walked in the grave and the body was there. So we don't have any direct evidence, or nobody alive today said, I saw Jesus Christ walking physically. Now, some of you have had visions and stuff like that, but nothing physical, at least that I know of. If there are, I want to know about it because we want to document it. And it's quite possible that there are physical events. So most murder cases convictions come from circumstantial evidence. Okay, and there's a list of them he gave me, right? And some are actually freed by circumstantial evidence, right? So back to the empty grave. Now, the first question you should ask me, if you're thinking, is, well, how do you know the grave was empty, Neil? Good question. Well, let me turn that question around. If the grave wasn't empty and the body of Christ was still in the grave, how long would the resurrection of Jesus have lasted? The story of the resurrection of Jesus have lasted. What's the fundamental crux of Christianity? Fundamental crux of Christianity is not the teachings of Jesus, but the fact that he was God and rose from the dead. Let's go back to this verse. If there is no resurrection of the dead and Christ did not rise from the dead, then our faith is in vain and we of all people are to be pitied. In other words, if Jesus Christ did not rise from the dead, Christians are deluded fools. So let me ask you this. Let's say it's 33 AD and you are 3 months after Jesus has risen from the dead, and you want to stop this religion, or has been crucified, and you want to stop this religion of Christianity. What's the easiest thing for you to do? Well, go find the dead body of Jesus and show it to everybody, right? Easiest thing. Now, were the apostles preaching the story in Rome, 1,500 miles away? Or were they preaching the story in downtown Jerusalem, a few minutes away? Now, remember how big Jerusalem is. You can walk across it in 8 minutes. Now, in the Bible, we find the Apostle Peter's first evangelistic talk in Acts 2. Here's what he says. He says, God raised Jesus, and now he's in the middle of the courtyard, not the Gentiles' courtyard, but the Jews' courtyard, because he's preaching to the Jews. And he's in the courtyard, and he's saying, God raised Jesus from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death. For God would not allow the Holy One to undergo decay. I can tell you confidently that the patriarch David died and was buried, and his tomb is here today. What tomb is he talking about? The one I went to visit 2,000 years later. I didn't know that this was going to work in an apologetic sermon when I visited the tomb. But what does he say? He says, I can tell you confidently that the patriarch David died and was buried, and his tomb is here today, right? And yet, Christ, he says, was not abandoned to the grave, nor did his body see decay. God has raised Jesus to life, and we are witnesses of this fact. Now, David's tomb, 8 minutes away. Jesus' tomb, less than 8 minutes away. How many people became Christians that day? Now, notice that he talks about David's tomb. Why? Because they were all there for the day of Pentecost, which is a feast. Well, guess what you do when you're from all parts of the Roman Empire coming to visit? You're going to go to all the sites. And one of the sites is David's tomb. You're going to make sure you visit David's tomb, like those other Jews that were there when I was there, right? Now, they're going to visit it, and he goes, oh, well, we just visited David's tomb. And he's making a direct comparison to what they just visited, to the tomb of Jesus, which is closer than David's tomb. And he's saying, in fact, we can see that the tomb of Jesus is right there, right? Where the city wall was. And what he's saying is, you can go check out the tomb. Now, let me ask you, 3,000 people became Christians. How many of them said, I don't need to go check out the tomb? People rise from the dead every day. No, what are they going to do? They're going to check out the tomb. And those who can't check out the tomb because they're older go, hey, Joseph, check out the tomb. Don't be an idiot. Don't be a schmuck. Check out the tomb, right? So they all go check out the tomb, or many of them go check out the tomb, and 3,000 people get saved. So that's why we know that the tomb was empty. And they get, like 3,000 people get baptized that day. Now, I was writing my book. I'm like, well, where did they get baptized? How did you baptize 3,000 people? So I'm doing the research. Turns out there were these huge baths right inside the courtyard. You see, underneath the temple was this huge cistern, and the water flowed in, and so it was constantly refreshing the water. It's amazing what you learn when you're doing all this research. And it's like, and they would have been able to get 3,000 people baptized in less than 20 minutes. Because each one of these baths will hold 50 people. Now, and then within a few years of that resurrection, Josephus tells us that James, the brother of Jesus, was executed for claiming that Jesus was God. So nobody was claiming that this was just an empty tomb. They're saying this is an empty tomb that proved Jesus rose from the dead. And by the way, Jesus is God. And further proof that the grave was empty was that the Jewish leaders who hated the Christians claimed that the disciples had stolen the body. Now, why would you do that if the body of Jesus was still in the grave? Now you go, well, how do we know? Because we did get the story of the stolen body from Matthew. Well, maybe Matthew was just making it up. Well, here's the problem. Matthew was preaching and writing his gospel, and the story was spreading while people were running around who were still alive. They would have said, no, that doesn't make sense at all. And you'd see that in the literature, but we don't see any of that. You go, well, did they have literature back then? Sure they did. In fact, when I talk about the story, the proof of the Bible, I show you all these documents written by the church fathers that precede the earliest copies of the Bible that tell us that the Bible was accurate. In other words, we have things that date to 80 AD that talk about stuff that we only found copies of in 125 AD, showing that it had been around even longer. We just didn't find a copy of it. So the Jews believed in only a physical resurrection. They wouldn't believe in a metaphysical resurrection. So only a physical resurrection would work. Christianity would have nothing to stand on without a physical resurrection because Christianity is based on facts and not concepts. Now, there's an apologist called Dr. Gary Habermas. I've had the privilege of meeting him a few times. He doesn't know who I am, but I know who he is, right? He did a survey of 30 years of German, French, and English critical scholarship relating to Jesus' resurrection. When he says critical, that means people who don't agree. Most of the critical scholarship is, very anti-Christian. Relating to Jesus' resurrection, he amassed a list of 2,200 sources. He identified 12 facts which are considered historical by a large majority of skeptical and conservative experts. So these are the 12 facts. 1, Jesus died by crucifixion. Almost everybody agrees that Jesus died by crucifixion. 2, Jesus was buried. Again, these are the facts that both Christians and non-Christians agree on. 3, Jesus' death caused the disciples to despair and lose hope, believing that his life was ended. 4, the tomb was discovered to be empty a few days later. 5, the disciples had experiences which they believed were little appearances of the risen Jesus. 6, the disciples were transformed from doubters, afraid to identify themselves with Jesus, to bold proclaimers of his death and resurrection. 7, this resurrection message was the center of preaching in the early church. 8, this message was especially proclaimed in Jerusalem, where Jesus died and was buried shortly before. 9, as a result of the preaching, the church was founded and grew. 10, Sunday became the day of worship instead of Saturday. 11, James, the brother of Jesus, a skeptic, was converted to faith when he believed he saw the risen Jesus. He was then executed for his faith, told to us by Josephus, no other. And 12, Paul, a persecutor of Christianity, was also converted by an experience which he likewise believed to be the appearance of the resurrected Jesus. These are the 12 minimal facts. Now, when I do this in a Bible study, especially with kids, I then say, okay, guys, you have 20 minutes to come up with a theory of how the tomb became empty, but meets all of these 12 conditions. And they spend 20 minutes, and they come up with the most outlandish stuff. And then the other teams, the other groups, have to show them why their theory doesn't work. So I don't have to do any work. I just let Team A show Team B that their plot on how Jesus' tomb got empty is stupid, and it's a lot of fun. We've got aliens, and then they refute the aliens theory. Although I think the aliens theory comes closest, right? Aliens came and transported his body off. But I've had, we've had all these interesting stuff, and this is something you should do. You should come up with a theory that would explain Jesus' empty tomb, but meets all these facts, right? But if we think about it, there are only two ways a tomb could have been empty: one by natural means, or two by supernatural means, right? So we're detectives. We want to prove that the grave, we can't just jump to Jesus rose from the dead. Let's look at every possible way the tomb could have been empty, right? So let's now solve this 2,000-year-old mystery as detectives. We're going to put our detective hat. We're going to look at every single way. The most obvious way the tomb could be empty is it was stolen by the disciples, right? Disciples went in there. They opened the tomb, took the body of Jesus. Turns out this is the easiest claim to disprove, right? Now, while this is not one of the minimal facts, the more I study it, the more, especially when I was doing my book, the more apparent it becomes that this is probably very true. The tomb was guarded by Roman soldiers. This is the real picture. Technology was really good back then. Color. Well, first of all, the tomb was on a Jewish man's property. Wasn't that convenient? Because if you look at the Holy Sepulchre and the tomb, the Mount of Crucifixion and the tomb, they're right next to each other. So I was always like, why? That's really convenient. Did Josephus just buy a tomb where he knew they were going to bury Jesus? No, it turns out that was a rocky place, and rich families bought tombs in caves, and they would carve out caves. Well, it turns out that Jesus was crucified on this mountain, and down below it was a bunch of rich people's tombs. Oh, that makes sense. Very commonly known. So if you're rich, you bought a tomb in a cave, right? Because that was nice. And so it was guarded by the Romans. Why was it guarded by the Romans? Because Jesus was a, quote, Roman prisoner. He was not a Jewish prisoner. He was a Roman prisoner executed by the Romans, so he would be guarded by the Romans. Well, the Roman guard unit was 16 men. It was told, Polybius, a historian up there, told us about these 16 men. And their job was to guard whatever they were guarding, and the punishment for losing their keep was death. And this is on purpose, so that they would rather die protecting what they were doing than die in failure. So they would die. They said, well, I'm going to die anyway. They're like, oh, man, don't make me guard something that everybody wants, right? So this is how it worked, right? There would be a guard. There would be 4 guards. There were 16 of them. There were 4 guards who would stand in front of the tomb, right? And normally you have a nice little animation here that kind of shows you, but we'll have to go step by step. These 4 guards would stand in front. Now the tomb the stone should be a circle, but I had a guy in India do it, and he didn't know that the tombstone was circular, and I didn't want to make him change it. I have a lot of fun. I have a lot of Indian guys working for me, and I get them to edit and make my apologetics talks nicer. Why? So they can read it. One guy was a Muslim, and he said, in fact, the guy who made this was a Muslim, and he wouldn't charge me for it. He said, oh, you're doing God's work. I can't charge you for it. I'm like, don't be silly. I want you to do other work too. I'm going to pay you. No, that would be haram. So it was very nice. I still paid him, but he didn't, he was like, he thought this was God's work. I'm like, yes, it is God's work. Read it. So anyway, so they would, and then at night they would sleep in a semicircle. I mean, not at night. There were 4 of them would be on guard, and every 4 hours they'd switch over. And then when they were relaxing, if they did sleep, they would sleep in a semicircle with 12 in front, and they would sleep with their heads on the inside. And the reason they slept with their heads on the inside is so that if you did want to attack them, you couldn't bash their heads. You'd have to get past their feet first, and so maybe they'd get up and get at you. So the apostles would have to come in a frontal assault. They'd have to bash the heads or whatever the people sleeping. Hopefully they didn't wake up. And the apostles, who are mainly fishermen, one tax collector, don't forget him. And they would have to defeat the 16 guards, take over 11 apostles. Remember, we didn't have Judas anymore. Take the 16 guards over, move the stone, grab the body of Jesus, come out with move the stone, grab the body of Jesus, come out there, and then fight everybody else off who was still left behind. You like this theory? You think it works? Strangely enough, none of the students ever proposed this theory. Well, the death knell for this whole theory is, as far as we know, almost every apostle died. Now, we can prove some of them for sure, but most of them are tradition. But we do know that they all left that country and they were persecuted for faith. Peter was crucified upside down. Andrew was crucified. Simon was crucified. The first James was beheaded. This is not the brother of Jesus. This is James, the son of the brother of John. The second James was sawed alive in pieces. Bartholomew was flayed alive with knives. Thomas was speared in India. Jude was killed by arrows. Matthew was killed in Ethiopia. Philip was killed in Aeropolis. In addition, two other potential plotters, James, the brother of Jesus, stoned to death. Paul, the spread of the gospel, first hated the Christians and then became one, was executed in Rome for it. So I want you to understand how this works. What sort of imbecilic idiot would concoct a lie then die gruesomely for it, all the while maintaining it was true? Now, many people will die for a lie somebody else tells them. You know, you're a 9/11 hijacker and Osama bin Laden tells you to go kill it for the glory of Allah, right? Now, you'll die for a lie that even Osama was willing to die for a lie that Muhammad had told him, right? But Muhammad was not willing to die for a lie that he made up. He died because someone poisoned him, right? So, would you die for a lie you made up? I want you to imagine the scene right after Jesus has been crucified. Okay, so here's the plan. Peter, we fight the guards, get the body out of the tomb, and stash it somewhere. And then we come back and tell a story that we'll probably have us hunted, hated, whipped, stoned, poor, powerless, and finally get us all killed, and we never change our mind. So who's with me on this? The fundamental basis for most of all their death sentences is precisely because they claimed Jesus was God and rose from the dead. I especially like the fact that his brother James, how many people have brothers? Okay, what would it take you to believe that your brother was God? And then die for it. I mean, that alone, right? And we didn't get the death of James from the Bible. They don't even talk about it. I mean, I think they mentioned something about it, but the real death of James comes from Josephus. And not one of these disciples recanted the story. And I'm not going to go through this, but the minimal facts are refuted by these points. So let's go to the next one. So minimal facts is the stolen by disciples. Let's go to the wrong tomb. Now, it's quite possible that they went to the wrong tomb, right? We know that there are a bunch of tombs in the area, right? So here's the question, though. So you are Josephus, not Josephus, you are Josephus of Arimathea, and you have a brand new tomb, and you're a Christian. Would you forget the tomb that you buried Jesus in? Like, oh, I know I paid a lot of money for this tomb. Maybe it was that tomb. I can't remember. They all look alike. It was a housing colony, like these, a development. Oh, yeah, development of tombs. There's a brand new tomb, right? No, I don't think so. What about the people who prepared him for burial, the women who put the spices on him? But would you forget that? And then the apostles, right? They're like, well, we don't, there's 20 tombs here. I don't know which one it was. Well, maybe they were running in and looking at the wrong tomb. Like there's a tomb over here. They're like, oh, look, he's alive. He's alive. And they're all happy. And meanwhile, the Romans are guarding the right tomb going, crazy Romans, crazy. These Jews are crazy. Right? Because they're running in and out of the wrong tomb. Or maybe the Romans were guarding the wrong tomb. The Sanhedrin were like, well, we're not sure which one. Oh, Joseph of Arimathea is a Pharisee. We're not sure which his tomb is, right? I mean, all these things get more and more weird when you think about it. The wrong tomb theory does not work specifically because eventually somebody would have figured out the right tomb and said, hey, move over 20 feet. Oh, well, never mind. Forget this whole Christian thing. We're going home. Didn't happen. And it also refutes all these different things. Like, for instance, the disciples had experiences. They turned into doubters. James, the brother of Jesus, skeptic, was converted to faith when he believed he saw the risen Jesus. Doesn't work with the wrong tomb. Okay, how about moved by the Jews or Romans? That's a possibility, right? Well, here's the problem with the rules moved by the Jews or Romans, because as we said, if the Jews had the body of Jesus, they hated this movement. The Romans couldn't really care less. They could care less. They're like, yeah, whatever. It's not a big deal. This is not a big thing. They didn't care. They only started caring around the time of Nero and Domitian. But during this time, they're like, yeah, it's just another sect. We don't care. But the Jews, oh man, this is a bad thing. Paul was running around killing Christians, right? Well, he'd have figured out where the tomb was, and he was a Pharisee. Nobody did that because they didn't have the body of Jesus. And also refuted by the minimum laws again, minimal facts. Okay, and Paul, appearance by Jesus, right? Okay, how about hallucination? Right? You've got Peter, Paul, and Mary, right? They were on, those of you who don't know, that was a singing group. Well, here's the problem. If you have a hallucination, it's unlikely that 12 people or 3,000 or 1,500 people saw Jesus, they claim. That means, Paul hallucinated, Peter hallucinated, John hallucinated, all the Marys hallucinated. I realize that Stephen and Paul got stoned. So, that is there. Some of you will get it in a few minutes. It's not the stoning we're talking about, right? But many of these people said that they claimed they'd seen him, the two on the road to Emmaus, right? So there's no way that these people were all hallucinating exactly the same thing. Psychologists will tell you can't hallucinate the same thing. You all hallucinate something different. If you actually see the same thing in a dream or a vision, that's really unexplainable unless it's purposely put there. Something like out of Inception. You ever see the movie? Great movie, by the way. Okay, so the LSD theory is refuted by these minimal facts. So let's talk about the Dave theory. I love the Dave theory. The Dave theory is really the twin theory. Jesus had a twin brother. And it's named by, you guys who are young don't remember this, but there was a movie called Dave. Dave looks just like the president. And so he replaces the president, but Dave's a liberal, so he's a nicer president than the president who's a conservative. I know, it's Hollywood. What do you expect, right? Dave is a socialist, and so he's going to spread everybody's money to everybody. Yeah, that works. Anyway, but the point is that Dave looked just like the president. So the idea is, well, what if Jesus had a brother? And there's actually a biblical scholar named Robert Greg Cavan, who's actually a professor and an expert in New Testament. And this is the best theory he could come up with. This is a guy who's an atheist, doesn't believe the Bible is true, but he says, based on the biblical sources, this is the only thing that works. So therefore, we must say that Jesus had a twin brother. Here's the problem, though. If you have a twin brother and other people know you have a twin brother, do you think that'll work? No. So it only works if you have a twin brother, but nobody knows you have a twin brother. Not even your mother. And certainly not your brothers. So you have to give this guy credit. He came up with a theory. Jesus is born in a cave. And right next to him in this cave are two twin brothers. I call them Dieter and Jeter for fun. And in the darkness of the cave, Mary is feeding Jesus or tending to him, and she accidentally picks up the wrong twin. One of the twins, and puts him in the manger. And somehow Jesus ends up with Dieter, and Dieter ends up going home with Joseph and Mary. You follow this so far? So he has a twin brother, but nobody knows that he has a twin brother. And Jesus grows up with his brother Dieter, who is not very twin-like. They're like, boy, Dieter, you don't look nothing like me. Well, Jesus, you look like my dad or mom. You must be adopted. I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm your twin brother. I was right there when you were born. And they're like, no, well, okay, it's just weird. I guess that's what happens. Sometimes twins are completely different. Okay, so that's fine. So they grow up looking completely different. And one day, they're walking through downtown Jerusalem or just outside Jerusalem, and they see a guy on a cross crucified. And Jesus says to Dieter notices the man on the cross looks just like him. So he decides to pretend he is Jesus risen from the dead. Dieter, who got swapped with Jesus' birth and thinks he's Jesus, was crucified for claiming to be God. And the real Jesus, who thinks he's Dieter, who looks nothing like his supposed twin brother Dieter. And so Dieter and the real Jesus say, look, let's pretend that you, Dieter, are this guy on the cross called Jesus. How many people are buying this? Don't laugh, it gets more ludicrous. So they break into the tomb, they steal the body, they defeat the Romans. They take him home. They bury the twin. Jeter shows up and says, "I am Jesus." And Mary, his mother, doesn't recognize that this guy's completely different from the other guy who looked just like him. And then he says, "You must be my mother." "No, I'm your sister. I'm your aunt." "Oh, you must be my brother." "No, I'm your cousin." He doesn't know anybody. "Oh, you must be Peter." "No, I'm John." Peter's a lot older than me, right? He doesn't know anybody, he doesn't know nothing. People are like, well, maybe the resurrection addled his mind. But he's supposed to be God? Okay. We can, and besides, come on. If somebody replaced your twin brother with an identical clone, a brother of yours with an identical clone, you would know that it was not your brother, right? So James, the brother of Jesus, became a Christian. Okay. So the last theory I want to cover is the swoon theory. Some people said Jesus just fainted and he came back awake in the grave. So he was crucified, didn't really die, like Romeo and Juliet. Maybe somebody gave him a drug, and then comes back, wakes up. A guy even wrote a book called The Passover Plot. Like they plotted this ahead of time, right? Jesus said, okay, here's a drug I want you to give me just before I get crucified, and then I will pretend I rose from the dead. The problem is most of these people don't understand what crucifixion really is. Jesus starts the Last Supper with, "This is my blood poured out for you for the forgiveness of sin." And then he goes to the Garden of Gethsemane, and if I show it, it's a transition, so you won't see it. But he says, it says in the garden, he was praying, and blood came out. He sweated out blood. Now, a lot of people think that the sweating blood is just hyperbole, right? It's just, oh yeah, nobody really sweats blood. Well, it turns out that you actually do sweat blood. There's called a hematidrosis. It's a real disease. It's a real problem. And it usually affects you when you are really emotionally in anguish. You can actually sweat. Now, it's not like blood dripping, pure blood. It's a blood dripped, because what happens, your perspiration glands start to ooze blood. And so you get a blood and sweat dripping together. And the Bible says, in being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. Now, the sad thing about hematidrosis is it results in a very fragile skin. Your skin is really tender and fragile. And so Jesus is in this great mental anguish, and he's suffering from hematidrosis. And the heartbreaking thing is that the next day he's going to experience 39 lashes in this condition. Now, the history tells us the Roman 39 lashes were from a whip of braided leather thongs with metal balls and bone woven into them. When the whip would strike the flesh, these balls would cause deep bruises and bone and would cut the flesh severely. If the soldier doing the whipping was in an extra foul mood, the cuts and intensity of the whipping could shred the back so much that the spine of the victim would be shown, and would go all the way down to the back of your legs, and it was a terrible, terrible thing. One physician who has studied Roman beatings said, as the flogging continued, the lacerations would tear into the underlying skeletal muscles and produce quivering ribbons of flesh. Eusebius, a 3rd century historian, says the sufferer's veins were laid bare, and the very muscle sinews and bowels of the victim were open to exposure. Isaiah 53 says, he was beaten for our transgressions, and by his stripes we are healed. As a result of this, Jesus goes into what we call hypovolemic shock. What is hypovolemic shock? It's shock caused by a low volume of blood. The heart races to try to pump blood that isn't there. Blood pressure drops, causing fainting or collapsing. The kidney stops producing urine to try and maintain what fluid is left in the body. And the person becomes extremely thirsty as the body craves fluids to replace its lost blood volume. Psalm 22:15, written 900 years before Christ, says, my strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to the roof of your mouth. Now, do you recall what happens on the way to the crucifixion? Jesus stumbles with his cross and faints, and Simon the Cyrene is forced to carry the cross. Why? Because he's suffering from hypovolemic shock. And he's thirsty. And after this, Jesus said, I thirst. When Jesus gets to Golgotha, the place where he is to be crucified, the soldiers tied his arms and his legs to the cross and then nailed them. But now we see pictures of nails right here. That doesn't make sense because that would rip right off. The nails are going to go right here. Why? Because it has to hold your arms up, and there's a good reason why they do that. I want you to push right here. It's called the median nerve, And if you push hard enough, you will feel something close to your funny bone sensation. This is a nerve that carries a lot of sensory input to your brain. And what happens is they put a nail right through that because they know this is a painful spot. And every time your arm rubs against it, you get that horrible sensation. And it would hold your arm up. In fact, this is, if you look at the x-ray of crucified victims, this is exactly where it would go. Now that is right here. Now, the Romans knew how to create great pain. And it's so equivalent of taking a pair of pliers and squeezing your funny bone nerve, the ulnar nerve. And the pain was so unbearable that they created a brand new word for this pain. That word is excruciating, which means out of the cross. And then they would do the same with his other hand and feet. Archaeologists found a crucified victim dating from the 1st century. They had been buried by his family. One thing they noticed was a nail right through his heel. Right? And Psalm 22:16, written 900 years before that, says, "They have pierced my hands and my feet." Now remember, the Psalms were written before the Romans invented crucifixion. Right? The crucifixion was invented to stop anyone from ever opposing the Roman Empire. It was designed to be painful. So Jesus would have a nail pierced through his heel. Does this remind you of something? And you will strike his heel. And then, of course, they have pierced my hands and my feet. Now, people didn't die easy from crucifixion. They weren't meant to. They were meant to suffer terribly, then die. They were meant to be an example for others. So when Jesus' wrists were nailed, as we know from the archaeological finds of crucifixion victims, his arms would have been pulled back and dislocated from his shoulders. They would have pulled his arms out of its socket. Why? Because the arms were meant to, you could use your arms to push up. And let me explain why that's important. Because, and of course, Psalm 22:14 says, "My bones are out of joint." Again, a prophecy 900 years before crucifixion had been invented. They'd raise the cross and they would drop he's on the cross, he's like this, and his arms are out of its socket, and they drop it. So guess what happens? You're going to lean forward. And when you lean forward, your chest is in an exhale position. So how do you breathe? The only way you breathe is you push down on that nail there. You feel all the sensations through the bones because you can't use your arms, and you push up and you take a breath. And then all the pain and everything, and you'll fall back until you need to work all that way up to get the next breath. And you could do this for days. Some people lasted 2 days. But by the time they took you off the cross, the damage was so great. Josephus says he moved over and aligned himself with the Romans, and 2 of his friends got crucified. He immediately went to the centurion, asked him to take him down, and one of them barely survived, the other one died. And though he survived, he was pretty much useless for the rest of his life. So once Jesus was hanging with exhale position, he couldn't breathe. Now, if you were to die, you would die from what? Suffocation. So the next day was the Shabbat. The Romans came at the request of the Jews, and what did they do to the 2 thieves? They broke their legs. Why did they break their legs? Because now you can't push yourself up, and you die of suffocation. But when they came to Jesus, he was already dead, and they didn't break his legs. You go, well, maybe he survived. Well, first, to breathe, you have to do what? A large motion, muscle motion. If you faint on the cross, what happens to you? You die. You can't breathe. Right? If you go into a coma, whatever. If you're unable, if you don't have the strength, you die. So everybody looking could tell when somebody was dead because they hadn't breathed in the last 4 minutes. But when they came to Jesus, he was already dead. Well, one, they know he's already dead. So how did he die? An analysis by a medical doctor indicates that at this point, because of the beating, the hematidrosis and all that, Christ's blood goes into some sort of shock. It can't clot. So your vitamin K is not working. It can't stop bleeding. Nothing stops the flow of blood. And so our Lord dies of massive blood loss as his blood literally all pours out. Isaiah says, we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned away, each one his own way. And the Lord has laid upon him the sin of us all. Jesus was dead, and they pierced his sides, his heart. The Bible says that when he died, Luke says it was about the 6th hour, which would be 12 o'clock. They counted the first hour at 6 a.m. There was darkness over all the earth until the 9th hour, till about 3 o'clock, and the sky, sun was darkened. Now, here's a good one. And Matthew says that, behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Why top to bottom? This is the veil in the temple is this massive, it says veil, it's this massive curtain, right? It's about 70 feet tall, and it's huge. It's multiple layers, and it's torn right in the middle from what? From top to bottom. Why? Because God says, I'm opening up the veil. Every person can enter into the sanctuary now, because the sacrifice has been paid for. The earth quaked and the rocks were split. And Joel says, the sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. Again, 500 years before Christ. And everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. For on Mount Zion in Jerusalem there will be deliverance. Well, here's a problem, though. If the sun is darkened, we have an eclipse. Well, if we have an eclipse, we can calculate the eclipse. But there's no eclipse around. You can go back and you can calculate this. There's no eclipse around that time. So people are like, see, they made it all up. Matthew put that in just so Luke put that in just so he could all match the prophecy. But there's no real reason for it. Until you go to the historian Phlegon Trailinus. I don't think you can read it because it's supposed to be all cool, so I'll read it for you. Phlegon Trailinus, not writing about the crucifixion, not writing about anything, he's talking about the Olympics. And he says, in the 4th year of the 202nd Olympiad, a failure of the sun took place greater than any previously known, and night came on at the 6th hour, noon, so that the stars actually appeared in the sky, and a great earthquake took place in Bithynia and overthrew a great part of Nicaea. No eclipse, but the historian tells us that something happened. The historian has nothing to do with Christianity or Christians, so Jesus was dead. Roman historians tell us that no less than 4 executioners had to confirm the death of a crucified criminal. And as we've seen, the Romans were very intimate with every form of death. They were experts. So then they show up. And by the way, if you execute a criminal and and that criminal shows up in the marketplace 3 days later, guess what happens to the Roman executioner? Okay? They took their job very seriously. It was a life or death situation for them in all cases. So one of the first things they do is they say, well, we're going to pierce him with a spear. So they take a spear, or lance rather, and they pierce him, right? Well, what does John say? He says blood and water comes out, whatever blood that's left. Now, not knowing anything but this fact, a doctor can tell you immediately that the person was dead. Why? Because they pierced the pericardial area, right? Now, this doesn't kill him. This results in blood and water. You know the person has been dead for a while when this happens. Why? Because the pericardic fluid, this is the fluid around the heart is called pericardial effusion. The fluid around the lungs is called pleural effusion. Both are thick and waxy, right? And what happens is they are always being mixed. When the heart is pumping, this pericardial effusion is being mixed with the blood. It's, sometimes the difference between plasma and blood, right? So what happens is, as long as you're alive, this is being mixed. Now, you could get pericardial effusion or something from your legs probably, but that's because your leg is far away from your heart. Let's say you have gangrene or something like that, and then it stops moving, well, the blood will separate from the fluid. But around your heart, it can't happen unless your heart has stopped beating. And so what happens is they know that Jesus, they don't know that, but we know that Jesus is dead. A doctor today can look at that and say, oh, yeah, not only is dead, but he's dead for a certain number of hours, because it takes time for those two to separate. But given all that, The refutation for the swoon theory is given to us by an atheist called Dr. David Strauss. This is what he says about the swoon theory. He says it's impossible that a being who had stolen half dead out of the sepulchre, the tomb, who crept about weak and ill and wanting medical treatment, who required bandaging, strengthening, and indulgence, which is off the tape, right, could have given to the disciples the impression that he was conqueror over death and the grave, the Prince of Life, an impression which lay at the bottom of their future ministry. Imagine that Jesus had been crucified. And he manages to get out of the grave. He pushes aside the stone somehow. He walks on those bloodied heels, and he's his shoulders are out of sockets, and he's walking around. Maybe he pushes them in, and he makes it to the disciples. The disciples wouldn't have said, "Oh, he's God." They would have said, "Get a doctor." In the words of Monty Python, he's not dead yet. Nobody would have thought this was the Prince of Life and Death and the ruler of the entire universe. And that's exactly what David Strauss says. It does not work. It does not work. And just remember, this wasn't just an empty grave. The disciples said they'd seen him, they'd touched him, they'd watched him eat, they saw him ascend into heaven. And then they what? They died for that personal claim. I was reading through some of the old fathers of the church. Clement of Rome says in his writings that he asked Peter, and Peter personally told him, "Look, I saw Jesus rise from the dead." Similarly, Polycarp was a disciple of John, and he says that John told him 6 times that Jesus is risen. I want you to imagine this. Like Polycarp's like, "Okay, John, Jesus rose from the dead? Yeah, I saw him. Okay." A month later, "Okay, now Jesus really rose from the dead? Yeah, I saw him." A year later, "John, can you just tell me one more?" "Polycarp, I'm telling you, I saw him rise from the dead." Yeah. And then he asked 3 more times. He says, "Look, I saw it." And then John gets what? Exiled under Domitian. Trajan actually lets him go, or Nerva lets him go, lets him come out of exile. So guess what? John's in my book because he's around at the time. It's really cool. Okay, so these minimal facts refute the swoon theory. Jesus really died by crucifixion, according to all these experts. The disciples had experience which they believed their literal appearance of the risen Jesus, and the disciples transformed from doubters to identify him with Jesus, because if it was a swoon, then it wouldn't have worked, right? And then they died for their death, which is for the belief. So that gets rid of all the possible theories. And I said, I've tried this with many groups to come up with more theories, and none of them even work. They're all outlandish, but they all have some form of this. So if and you can't see this, but given all this and the elimination of other possible solutions, we're left with only one option. Now, we know that God exists using science. We know there are up to 6 supernatural dimensions, right? We know the physical minimal facts are true, right? So what is left? The only thing that's left is that the supernatural really happened. The resurrection. He is risen. Circumstantial evidence proves it. This is a case, in fact, that will stand up in a court of law. Years ago, I wrote this. I said on my my website, I said, proving the resurrection really happened, a case that'll stand up in a court of law. Well, one day I get a call. And it's like, "Hi, this is," I can't remember his name. I probably have his email. It says, "Yeah, I'm with the San Diego Christian Lawyers Association. And we saw that, and we'd like you to come present it." I'm like, "Oh my goodness, I shouldn't have said that." But I'm like, "Now I'm too far deep." So they fly me down to San Diego. I present to the Christian Lawyers Association. None of them have any money. They're students. So somebody else pays for me to fly down. I'm like, "You're supposed to be lawyers." Yeah, well. So I fly down, and I do this presentation instead of the group. There's like 40, 50 people there. I said, "Look," and I admit, "Look, I just kind of put that there because I thought it made sense. But you tell me at the end of this if it stands in law." And so at the end of it, I said, "Let me ask you a question. Would this stand up in a court of law?" And they all said yes, but the judge would not allow the evidence. Let me be real. If God can create a universe, but small, creating matter, energy, and time out of nothing, then raising himself from the dead is an easy task. But only a God could do it. Somebody, when I do my talk on proving God exists by using the Bible, I say, what's the greatest miracle ever described in the Bible? And many people say resurrection. And I go, no, it's a puny miracle. If you can create time, matter, energy, life, every single thing, bring somebody to life is easy. This is easy for God. You know, Arthur Conan Doyle said something, the Sherlock Holmes guy, said something, if the probable is impossible, then the improbable must be possible. See, Christianity isn't a blind faith, it's a rational faith built on a solid historical and logical foundation. The grave was empty because Jesus Christ really rose from the dead. He's risen indeed. And not only did the disciples claim that, but also 500 people saw him, including a Pharisee who was first trying to kill all the Christians. That's Paul. There's something happened in AD 30 that has changed the world and everyone who studied the evidence forever. Jesus said, I am God. And I will prove that to you by rising and dying and then rising from the dead. By doing something that nobody can fake and can't be done by anything else. So if God really proved himself that day, then the question is, why did he do it? He did it because we have all sinned. And we need to repent and be reconciled to Jesus. And if you heard me talk about why Christ had to die, Jesus, I get to that even with this. If you go to I should have it, mammon.substack.com and look up reasoning the gospel, deriving the gospel from reason alone or something like that. If you have a perfect being, he has to do justice, but he also has to be loving. But if he's loving, how can he do justice? How can he forgive you without asking for justice? He could do it if he's willing to pay the price himself. Then he's both loving and just. But you have to accept the price. You have to repent and ask for forgiveness and allow Christ to be the Lord of all. But here's the end. Have you lost a loved one? Is that the end? The end of life? The end of dreams? The Bible says if there is no resurrection, then Christ will not rise from the dead. But then it goes on to say, but Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the first fruit of those who have fallen asleep. You know, I started this by saying, do we just believe in Christianity because it's a comforting fantasy? When people have died, do we want some comfort for them? Because if Christ rose from the dead, then our hope is real. Our hope is not based on blind faith because logic, history, and facts prove it. If he's risen indeed, and death is not the end game. Thank you very much.